The degree to which eating dog food is tolerable can be measured in direct proportion to how good the dog food actually is, and this was not good dog food. Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. I'm Dave Plummer, a retired operating systems engineer from the MS-DOS and Windows 95 days, and today we're diving into one of the wildest development stories in Windows history, the saga of Windows Longhorn. It was the last product at Microsoft that I ever worked on. All I know is that I retired while working on it, and after I left, they had to entirely reset the codebase. Deduce from that what you will. But what was Longhorn? Well, most people would tell you that it's the code name for what eventually became Windows Vista. Vista was what Longhorn eventually became, but it's nothing like it was intended to be. Longhorn is the tale of big ambitions, technical nightmares, and an extraordinary comeback. If you've ever wondered why Vista turned out the way it did, or how a project at Microsoft could go so off the rails that management had to entirely hit the reset button, stick around. This is the inside story of Longhorn, the revolutionary Windows that almost was, and how it rose from its own ashes, told by somebody who was there. Longhorn was supposed to be revolutionary. In the early 2000s, after the success of Windows XP, Microsoft's plan was to follow up with an interim release codenamed Longhorn before the next major Windows, codenamed Blackcomb. In fact, the codename Longhorn itself comes from a bar between those two ski mountains, Whistler and Blackcomb in British Columbia, a nod that Longhorn would be a stopgap between Windows and XP, or Whistler, and the big future OS to be known as Blackcomb. But as development went on, Longhorn grew in scope. It started absorbing many ambitious features that were originally intended for the future Blackcomb release. In other words, this minor interim release ballooned into a major overhaul of Windows, and the goalposts would keep moving. So what was the vision? Well, Microsoft wanted Longhorn to reimagine what Windows could be. We're talking about very fundamental changes under the hood and a flashy, completely new user experience on the top. One of the crown jewels of this vision was something called WinFS, short for Windows Future Storage. The idea behind WinFS was to replace or augment the traditional file system known as NTFS with a database-driven system. The goal was to be able to instantly search and organize all of your files by their content, tags, relationships, and so on, not just by file names and folders. Your documents, emails, photos, and everything would actually live in a database so that finding a file or grouping information would be as easy as querying data. It was a bold plan to move beyond the decades-old metaphor of files and folders into a richer, smarter way of storing information. Another pillar of Longhorn's vision was deep integration of Microsoft's new .NET framework into Windows. Now, .NET was a managed code platform, meaning it was a memory-safe, modern programming model that had debuted in the early 2000s. The Longhorn team wanted to leverage .NET to modernize Windows development. That meant new APIs and subsystems written in managed code instead of the good old C++ Win32 all the way. For example, Longhorn introduced Avalon, a code name for the new presentation subsystem, essentially a next-generation graphical user interface framework built on .NET. Avalon itself would later become known as the Windows Presentation Foundation. There was also Indigo, a new communications and web services framework, later known as Windows Communication Foundation. These were all part of what Microsoft at the time called the WinFX technologies, signaling that Longhorn's developers were pushing towards managed code and new frameworks for the future of apps. It's not that the Windows kernel itself would be rewritten in C#, that was never the case or planned, but much of the user-level infrastructure and APIs were planned to get this .NET-based overhaul, bringing safer code and quicker development to Windows. And we can't forget the user interface dreams. Longhorn was slated to entirely revamp the Windows UI with a design language later dubbed Aero, a clean, glass-like visual style with fancy transparent effects, animations, and a desktop composition engine to take advantage of 3D graphics hardware. Windows XP's colorful Luna interface was going to be yesterday's news. Longhorn would be sleek, modern, and visually rich. Features like a sidebar with gadgets for weather, news, stocks, and so on were prototyped. Even the start menu and taskbar were being reimagined. Essentially, Microsoft wanted Longhorn to look and feel like a major step into the future, and under the hood, it truly was intended to be. At the 2003 Professional Developers Conference, or PDC, Microsoft gave developers a tantalizing peek at Longhorn's promised features and UI. They demoed concept screens showing a sidebar with live tiles, translucent Windows frames, and a snazzier start menu. It felt like looking at Windows, but a couple years into the future. Internally, folks were generally amped, at least at first. Avalon, Indigo, and WinFS were often called the three pillars of Longhorn. Microsoft even handed out early Longhorn builds to PDC attendees, a build actually numbered 4051 to showcase some of these technologies. The press and developer community were buzzing about how Longhorn might change everything. It's not often that an operating system promises to reinvent multiple core pillars all at once. Longhorn was aiming for the sky. But, and you knew a but was coming, big ambitions often come with big challenges. As development ramped up, Longhorn started to show signs that it was buckling under its own weight. Those of us inside Microsoft or connected to the project could see these storm clouds gathering on the horizon even as the hype was building. The project was in trouble and it would soon become obvious to everybody. One major problem was that with so many new features being developed simultaneously, the Windows codebase itself became fragile and bloated. Early pre-release builds of Longhorn, when tested, were not pretty. I recall colleagues testing these builds on high-end PCs at the time and reporting that memory usage went through the roof. And a big culprit was WinFS. It was an amazing concept, but the early implementation was pretty memory hungry. Testers noted that the WinFS service would gobble up RAM and CPU cycles endlessly. In one build, Outlook Express, the mail client, had been modified to store its emails in WinFS, and when WinFS bogged down, it would take your email down with it. Many testers simply disabled WinFS to get any usable performance out of the system. That's not a great sign for a flagship feature. Performance and memory issues were only one facet. Stability was another. The development process for Longhorn was, to put it kindly, chaotic. With teams pouring in new code for Avalon, for Indigo, and the new desktop window manager for the revamped shell, and so on, the integration of all these pieces became a nightmare. We had a tradition at Microsoft called dogfooding, meaning using our own daily builds of the OS to do our actual work. For Longhorn, dogfooding was tough. Builds were often too unstable to run for very long. The degree to which eating dog food is tolerable can be measured in direct proportion to how good the dog food actually is, and this was not good dog food. I heard reports that the Build Lab, the team that compiles the Windows source into actual installable builds, was constantly broken. Developers would check in code that unknowingly broke something else, and it became increasingly difficult to get a single build of Longhorn where all the big features worked together without major bugs. One legendary Microsoft engineer, Dave Cutler, the father of Windows NT, later quipped that the Longhorn guys just couldn't get Longhorn out of the Build Lab. That's a biting way to say that the team was writing code faster than they could stabilize it. Now add to this mix the challenge of backward compatibility. Windows has always prided itself on running older applications, supporting a vast array of hardware, and basically not breaking what people already have. With Longhorn, this was extraordinarily hard. The new graphics engine meant that old display drivers had to be rewritten or to run in compatibility modes. The new storage engine, WinFS, was a radical change that no third-party software had ever seen before. And parts of the OS were being refactored into managed.NET code, which was unproven yet at such scale. Ensuring that existing software and services would continue to work on this newfangled Longhorn was a massive undertaking. If you pushed too far with something like WinFS or a new security model, you might break a critical enterprise app or somebody's favorite utility. The Longhorn team was walking a tightrope. Innovate aggressively, but don't break Windows. Not an easy balancing act. And then came an external factor that really threw a wrench into Longhorn's timeline: security. In mid-2002, Bill Gates sent his famous Trustworthy Computing memo, essentially mandating that security and reliability would become top priority across Microsoft. This was largely in response to the wave of computer worms and viruses such as Code Red, Nimda, and the Blaster worm in 2003 that were exploiting Windows weaknesses. The Windows team had to pause and secure the house. That meant diverting a lot of developers to work on Windows XP Service Pack 2, a major security-focused update, and on Server 2003, which was released in 2003, of course, to make sure that those were solid. Longhorn development slowed as many engineers, including myself, were retasked with improving the security of Windows XP. This was absolutely the right call for customers. XP needed those fixes. But it further delayed Longhorn and scattered the team. Features that weren't near completion kept hanging out in a half-done state while attention shifted elsewhere. By 2004, the organizational chaos around Longhorn was becoming evident. Internally, there was a lot of feature creep. More and more ideas being thrown into the mix without a realistic plan for finishing them in any reasonable time frame. It felt like every group had some cool innovation they wanted Longhorn to include, and for a while, management seemingly said yes to almost all of them. The vision was grand, perhaps too grand. One observer later described it as features being written at an alarming rate with a significant lack of QA or vision of true requirement. Ouch. Morale on the team started to slip. It's demoralizing as an engineer when you can see the light at the end of the tunnel getting further away and not closer. Some devs were burning out from the long hours trying to make all the moving parts work. Others grew frustrated that so much was being built only to collapse every time the latest build failed. There was a real fear that maybe this thing would never quite come together. Around this time, I took a 3-month sabbatical, and to make a long story short, I retired instead of coming back. Part of it was that I never drank the Longhorn Kool-Aid. Some of it was very cool, don't get me wrong, but I'm an incrementalist, not a revolutionary. I prefer to add things one solid feature at a time rather than reinventing everything all at once as part of some grand vision. But at the end of the day, even though it was just a small factor in my decision to retire, it almost seems like I dodged a bit of a bullet, as from what I heard, things only got worse. A particularly telling anecdote from this era comes from Dave Cutler, the engineer I mentioned earlier. And if you haven't seen my interview with Dave yet, be sure to check it out after this video. In my interview, he shared his perspective on Longhorn. Cutler was leading a parallel effort, a version of Windows for 64-bit processors based on the stable Windows Server 2003 code. He watched the Longhorn project with a critical eye. He even nicknamed it Doesn't Matter Horn, a pun suggesting that Longhorn didn't matter or might never ship. The reason? He saw that the client team was prioritizing flashy features over solid engineering.
And Chris says, oh, I can't live with that. He says, consumers don't expect the quality that the server people do. We can do it in a year and a half. Thereupon, we split the code base. The server went one way, and the consumer vision went the other way. It wasn't long before the consumer software hardly would build and hardly would run. So they're continuing on with this buggy code base without all those security fixes in it. Meantime, we got Longhorn over here still going. And its name is now morphed into Does It Matter Horn.
There was an internal split. The Longhorn client team was churning out new features quickly with the attitude that consumer Windows could be less rigorously engineered than server Windows, while the server team, folks like Cutler, took a slower, more methodical approach to ensure stability. At one point, Cutler noted how bad things had gotten and basically told management, "This is BS." Not the word I'm sure he used, but you guys should probably switch the code base to the one the server team has been working on all along.
We turned over some code that, like a shovel, you turn over manure.
He was advocating for scrapping Longhorn's messy core and instead using the known good core from Windows Server, which by then included all the security improvements and the solid groundwork from XP SP2 and Server 2003. You can imagine that within Microsoft, this was a heated discussion. It's never pleasant to consider throwing away years of work, and it certainly bruised some egos to admit that the Longhorn project had gone too far off track. Then came the breaking point. In the summer of 2004, Microsoft's leadership made a dramatic decision, one almost unheard of at that scale. They hit the reset button on all of Longhorn. On August 27, 2004, it was publicly announced that Longhorn as it existed was being reset. Practically, this meant that the existing Longhorn codebase would be scrapped, and development would start fresh from the Windows Server 2003 SP1 codebase. The team would then carefully re-add the most important Longhorn features on top of that stable foundation. This was a massive course correction. Now, I left before the reset, but I remember hearing about the announcement. It was shocking, even internally. Imagine telling hundreds of developers and testers, all that work that you've done for the past 3 years, we're going to set that aside and do something else. It was devastating, and yet, oddly enough, a relief for some. Devastating because nobody wants to see their hard work tossed out, but a relief because by this point everybody knew it wasn't working. The project had become a death march of sorts, and now there was a chance to make a fresh start. The reset also meant significant changes in scope. A lot of those pie-in-the-sky features had to be cut or postponed to later releases. The most high-profile casualty was indeed WinFS. Microsoft announced that WinFS would not ship with the next version of Windows. It was simply too behind schedule and too problematic. They did continue developing WinFS separately for a while. There were even beta releases of WinFS for testers a year or two later, but ultimately WinFS never made it into a production Windows release. It was a case of an idea ahead of its time, brilliant but impractical to ship back in 2006. Another feature, Next-Gen Secure Computing, also known as Palladium, which was an ambitious security initiative, was also dropped from the release roadmap. Microsoft had to be ruthless, only including features that could be realistically completed and stabilized in the new timeframe. Essentially, Longhorn had to be rescoped to something achievable, and so the team regrouped. They took Windows Server 2003 SP1, which was a solid, reliable version of Windows, and used that as the new core for Longhorn, and from there they began reintegrating those salvageable parts. This time they applied the lessons learned. The development was much more disciplined. Features like Avalon, the new graphics UI stack, and Indigo for communications were still in because they were far enough along and important enough. The new desktop window manager, enabling those arrow effects, was also retained. But now everything was built on a no unstable base instead of that shaky pre-reset code. Dave Cutler's device was essentially being followed. Client windows and server windows were unified on the same core going forward. No more divergence where the server is stable and the client is a wild experiment. They would continue to share the same fundamentals. And indeed, ever since that reset, Microsoft has kept client and server windows in lockstep on a single codebase even if the releases don't align, which is a huge positive legacy of this saga. The development after 2004 was essentially a mad dash to get the new Longhorn, now truly Windows version 6, ready to ship. By mid-2005, Microsoft felt confident enough to give it an official product name, Windows Vista. The word Vista was meant to evoke a beautiful view, a fresh perspective, probably to distance itself from the negativity surrounding Longhorn's delays. As Vista took shape, it became clear that it would deliver some of Longhorn's promise, but not all. So what made it and what didn't? Well, Vista, what was once to be Longhorn, did ship with a lot of visible enhancements. The Aero GUI made it to primetime. Vista introduced the translucent glass window frames, smooth animations, and a new start menu with integrated search. The sidebar with gadgets also appeared. You could have a clock, weather, RSS feed, and so on your desktop sidebar, a direct descendant of the Longhorn sidebar concept. The instant search capability was present through the Explorer and Start menu thanks to an indexing service. Now, this wasn't WinFS, the files were still on NTFS, but you had a fast index to search files and even their file metadata, which delivered some of the user experience that WinFS had aimed for. In Vista, if you hit the Start button and start typing, results pop up almost instantly. And that was new, and it felt pretty magical compared to the old Windows XP search dog. You do remember the little search dog helper, right? Vista also brought in the Avalon graphics infrastructure as the Windows Presentation Foundation, or WPF, even if the OS itself only used WPF in a few places, like parts of the Media Center app and certain system apps. Indigo shipped as well, renamed to WCF, enabling modern ways for applications to communicate over networks. These were delivered as part of the .NET Framework 3.0 that came with Vista, essentially fulfilling the plan of integrating those .NET pillars into Windows. On the security front, the lessons of 2003 to 2004 were deeply ingrained in Vista. It shipped with user account control, a feature that, while annoying to many users initially, was a direct result of the new security mindset. Even administrators would run with limited privileges most of the time to prevent malware or accidental changes from wrecking the system. Internally, Vista had been engineered with a much more rigorous security development lifecycle, meaning that more threat modeling, code reviews, and testing for vulnerabilities was done than earlier Windows. So in many ways, Vista was more solid under the hood than even XP had been, even if it had got a reputation for being a bit heavy. That said, Vista's launch in late 2006 wasn't all smooth sailing. Although the development did coalesce and Vista shipped, it arrived with a bit of a mixed reception. Many of you probably remember the stories or experienced it yourself. Vista was reasonably resource heavy, and if you tried to run it on a machine that was fine for XP but not much more, you were likely in for a bad time. It really needed a decent GPU for the Aero feature and more RAM than was common on PCs sold just a few years prior. Some drivers weren't ready or were unstable because hardware vendors had trouble keeping up with the changes. The graphics driver model in particular had changed significantly to accommodate the new desktop window manager. So a lot of people who upgraded early on had issues with devices not working or with system crashes. And the press was pretty harsh about Vista's problems, and it gained a bit of an unfair stigma. I say unfair because with a few updates and on proper hardware, Vista was actually a pretty solid OS, but first impressions tend to stick. Nonetheless, Microsoft had delivered what Longhorn became. It was no longer vaporware or endless beta. Vista was real for better or worse. Now stepping back, you might wonder, was the Longhorn project a failure? Well, yes and no. It failed to deliver on its original promises. WinFS never shipped, and many of the more radical ideas were cut, and the schedule slipped dramatically. After all, Vista arrived more than 5 years after XP, whereas originally Longhorn was thought of as a 3-year or less gap. It was also something of a management failure in that it took a near crisis for Microsoft to course correct. But Longhorn's legacy is complex and in many ways positive. For one, the reset and recovery from Longhorn shaped Microsoft's culture and engineering practices going forward. The fact that they eventually pulled a workable Vista out of the disastrous Longhorn effort is a testament to the company's ability to learn and adapt, albeit painfully. Post-Vista, the Windows team adopted more disciplined planning. The very next release, Windows 7, which came in 2009, was essentially Vista done right, and it polished and optimized everything that Vista introduced, and it was a huge success. Without the crucible of Longhorn/Vista, Windows 7 might not have been as good as it was. In fact, a lot of folks who skipped Vista and went straight to Windows 7 were indirectly enjoying the fruits of Longhorn's ambitious features, just in more refined form. Today, whether on Windows 10, 11, macOS, or even your smartphone, you expect to hit a search box and find files or information reasonably instantly. WinFS's grand vision didn't materialize, but it definitely pushed the envelope on what users would come to expect. Microsoft ended up building a robust indexing service into Windows, first in Vista and improved in later versions, and introduced the idea of libraries in Windows 7. Libraries are virtual folders aggregating content types, something like what WinFS's promise of organizing by metadata would have done. On the developer side, the .NET framework became a core part of Windows development. Vista shipped .NET 3.0, and since then .NET has grown by leaps and bounds, and today we have .NET 9, a huge ecosystem of apps and tools built upon it. The idea of using managed code for safety and productivity is now pretty mainstream at Microsoft. Consider that Microsoft's latest frameworks and even parts of Windows 10, like the new Settings app, parts of the new Start menu, and so on, use .NET under the hood. Longhorn was the inflection point where .NET moved from a fringe developer option to a core Windows technology. Another legacy? The emphasis on security from the Longhorn reset era stuck. Modern Windows, starting with Vista, has a security architecture that's much more robust. UAC, driver signing, sandboxing features, and so on all took root in that time frame. While users grumbled about permission prompts, in hindsight, that was a necessary evolution. If Longhorn hadn't hit the wall, maybe those security lessons would have come even later with even more costly consequences during the age of internet connectivity. And perhaps the biggest lesson Longhorn taught was about project management and focus. You can have the best engineers in the world, and Microsoft had plenty of brilliant people on Longhorn. But if the project lacks clear focus, or if priorities keep shifting, and if you're trying to do too much at once, you can easily get a big mess instead of a great product. After Longhorn Vista, Microsoft became a lot more careful about not letting Windows projects get so unwieldy. The cycle of huge monolithic Windows releases gave way to a more incremental approach, and eventually the Windows as a Service model in Windows 10. It's ironic because even though Longhorn aimed to revolutionize everything in one go, the way it actually influenced Windows was by prompting it to a more evolutionary improvement in the future. Just the way I likes it. From a personal perspective, as somebody who lived through some of the Longhorn saga from the inside and watched the rest from the outside, it's a fascinating cautionary tale. It shows that even a company with virtually limitless resources and a track record of shipping big products can get in over its head. The story of Longhorn is one of hubris and humility. Microsoft reached for the stars, stumbled, but then humbled itself to regroup and ultimately deliver something worthwhile. And many of the innovations did survive in some form. It just took a couple of releases and several more years to fully bake them. So that's the story of Longhorn in a nutshell. A dream of a revolutionary OS, an epic struggle to deliver it, and a dramatic reset, and then ultimately the birth of Windows Vista, a scarred but significant milestone in the Windows lineage. It's a story of overreaching, but also of learning and recovery, and it left an imprint on all Windows releases that followed. If you found this sneak peek behind the scenes informative or interesting, please remember that I'm mostly in this for the subs and likes, so I'd be honored if you consider leaving me one of each before you go today. And if you're already subscribed, thank you. If you've got a question or comment about this video, please put it in the comments, and once a week, not only do we genuinely read them online, we also go through and we answer them every Friday on Shop Talk. Be sure to check it out on the Dave's Attic channel, which is a separate channel, but you can go there and find episodes going back for several months of Shop Talk, and I think, or at least I hope, that you'll enjoy them. In the meantime and in between time, hope to see you next time, right here in Dave's Garage.